I pulled Chauvelez down and showed the hole to him. It was impossible for the raft to go through it. We pulled our clothes from the raft and tied them into a very tight bundle and swam downward with them until we found the hole again and went through it. We ended up on a water slide, like the ones in an amusement park. Rocks covered with lichen and moss allowed us to slide for a great distance without being injured at all. Then we came into an enormous cathedral-like cave where the water continued flowing waist deep. We saw the light of the sky at the end of the cave and waded out. Without saying a word, we spread out our clothes and let them dry in the sun, then headed back for town. Chauvelez was nearly inconsolable because he had just lost his father's raft. My father would have died there, he finally conceded. His body would never have gone through the hole we went through. He's too big for it. My father's a big, fat man, he said. But he would have been strong enough to walk his way back to the entrance. I doubted it, as I remembered at times, due to the inclination, the current was astoundingly fast. I conceded that perhaps a desperate big man could have finally walked his way out with the aid of ropes and a lot of effort. The issue of whether Chauvelez's father would have died there or not wasn't resolved then, but that didn't matter to me. What mattered was that for the first time in my life, I had felt the sting of envy. Chauvelez was the only being I have ever envied in my life. He had someone to die for, and he had proved to me that he would do it. I had no one to die for, and I had proved nothing at all. In the symbolic fashion, I gave Chauvelez the total cake. His triumph was complete. I bowed out. That was his town, those were his people, and he was the best among them as far as I was concerned. When we parted that day, I spoke a banality that turned out to be a deep truth when I said, "Be the king of them, Chauvelez. You're the best." I never spoke to him again. I purposely ended my friendship with him. I felt that this was the only gesture I could make to denote how profoundly I had been affected by him. Don Juan believed that my indebtedness to Chauvelez was imperishable, that he was the only one who had ever taught me that we must have something we could die for before we could think that we have something to live for. "If you have nothing to die for," Don Juan said to me once, "how can you claim that you have something to live for? The two go hand in hand, with death at the helm." The third person Don Juan thought I was indebted to beyond my life and my death was my grandmother on my mother's side. In my blind affection for my grandfather, the male, I had forgotten the real source of strength in that household, my very eccentric grandmother. Many years before I came to their household, she had saved a local Indian from being lynched. He was accused of being a sorcerer. Some irate young men were actually hanging him from a tree on my grandmother's property. She came upon the lynching and stopped it. All the lynchers seemed to have been her godsons, and they wouldn't dare go against her. She pulled the man down and took him home to cure him. The rope had already cut a deep wound on his neck. His wounds healed, but he never left my grandmother's side. He claimed that his life had ended the day of the lynching and that whatever new life he had no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. Being a man of his word, he dedicated his life to serving my grandmother. He was her valet, mayordomo, and counselor. My aunts said that it was he who had advised my grandmother to adopt a newborn orphan child as her son, something that they resented more than bitterly. When I came into my grandparents' house, my grandmother's adopted son was already in his late 30s. She had sent him to study in France. One afternoon, out of the blue, a most elegantly dressed, husky man got out of a taxi in front of the house. The driver carried his leather suitcases to the patio. The husky man tipped the driver generously. I noticed in one glance that the husky man's features were very striking. He had long, curly hair, long, curly eyelashes. He was extremely handsome without being physically beautiful. His best feature was, however, his beaming, open smile, which he immediately turned on me. "May I ask your name, young man?" he said, with the most beautiful stage voice I had ever heard. The fact that he had addressed me as a young man had won me over instantly. "My name is Carlos Arana, sir," I said. "And may I ask in turn, what is yours?" He made a gesture of mock surprise. He opened his eyes wide and jumped backward, as if he'd been attacked. Then he began to laugh uproariously. At the sound of his laughter, my grandmother came out to the patio. When she saw the husky man, she screamed like a small girl and threw her arms around him in a most affectionate embrace. He lifted her up as if she weighed nothing and twirled her around. I noticed then that he was very tall. His huskiness hid his height. He actually had the body of a professional fighter. He seemed to notice that I was eyeing him. He flexed his biceps. "I've done some boxing in my day, sir," he said, thoroughly aware of what I was thinking. My grandmother introduced him to me. She said that he was her son Antoine, her baby, the apple of her eye. She said that he was a dramatist, a theater director, a writer, a poet. The fact that he was so athletic was his winning ticket with me. I didn't understand at first that he was adopted. I noticed, however, that he didn't look at all like the rest of the family. While every one of the members of my family were corpses that walked, he was alive, vital from the inside out. We hit it off marvelously. I liked the fact that he worked out every day, punching a bag. I liked immensely that not only did he punch the bag, he kicked it too in the most astounding style, a mixture of boxing and kicking. His body was as hard as a rock. One day, Antoine confessed to me that his only fervent desire in life was to be a writer of note. "I have everything," he said. "Life has been very generous to me. The only thing I don't have is the only thing I want: talent. The muses don't like me. I appreciate what I read, but I cannot create anything that I like to read. That's my torment. I lack the discipline or the charm to entice the muses, so my life is as empty as anything can be." Antoine went on to tell me that the one reality that he had was his mother. He called my grandmother his bastion, his support, his twin soul. He ended up by voicing a very disturbing thought to me. "If I didn't have my mother," he said, "I wouldn't live." I realized then how profoundly tied he was to my grandmother. All the horror stories that my aunts had told me about the spoiled child Antoine became suddenly very vivid for me. My grandmother had really spoiled him beyond salvation, yet they seemed so very happy together. I saw them sitting for hours on end, his head on her lap as if he were still a child. I had never heard my grandmother converse with anybody for such lengths of time. Abruptly, one day Antoine started to produce a lot of writing. He began to direct a play at the local theater, a play that he had written himself. When it was staged, it became an instant success. His poems were published in the local paper. He seemed to have hit a creative streak. But only a few months later, it all came to an end. The editor of the town's paper publicly denounced Antoine. He accused him of plagiarism and published in the paper the proof of Antoine's guilt. My grandmother, of course, wouldn't hear of her son's misbehavior. She explained it all as a case of profound envy. Every one of those people in that town was envious of the elegance, the style of her son. They were envious of his personality, of his wit. Indeed, he was the personification of elegance and savoir-faire. But he was a plagiarist, for sure. There was no doubt about it. Antoine never explained his behavior to anyone. I liked him too much to ask him anything about it. Besides, I didn't care. His reasons were his reasons as far as I was concerned. But something was broken. From then on, our lives moved in leaps and bounds, so to speak. Things changed so drastically in the house from one day to the next that I grew accustomed to expect anything, the best or the worst. One night, my grandmother walked into Antoine's room in the most dramatic fashion. There was a look of hardness in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "Something terrible has happened, Antoine," she began. Antoine interrupted her. He begged her to let him explain. She cut him off abruptly. "No, Antoine, no," she said firmly. "This has nothing to do with you. It has to do with me. At this very difficult time for you, something of greater importance yet has happened. Antoine, my dear son, I have run out of time. I want you to understand that this is inevitable," she went on. "I have to leave, but you must remain. You are the sum total of everything that I have done in this life. Good or bad, Antoine, you are all I am. Give life a try. In the end, we'll be together again anyway. Meanwhile, however, do, Antoine, do. Whatever, it doesn't matter what, as long as you do." I saw Antoine's body as it shivered with anguish. I saw how he contracted his total being, all the muscles of his body, all his strength. It was as if he had shifted gears from his problem, which was like a river, to the ocean. "Promise me that you won't die until you die," she shouted at him. Antoine nodded his head. My grandmother, the next day, on the advice of her sorcerer counselor, sold all her holdings, which were quite sizable, and turned the money over to her son, Antoine. And the following day, very early in the morning, the strangest scene that I had ever witnessed took place in front of my 10-year-old eyes. The moment in which Antoine said goodbye to his mother. It was a scene as unreal as the set of a moving picture. Unreal in the sense that it seemed to have been concocted, written down somewhere. Created by a series of adjustments that a writer makes and a director carries out. The patio of my grandparents' house was the setting. Antoine was the main protagonist, his mother the leading actress. Antoine was traveling that day. He was going to the port. He was going to catch an Italian liner and go over the Atlantic to Europe on a leisurely cruise. He was as elegantly dressed as ever. A taxi driver was waiting for him outside the house, blowing the horn of his taxi impatiently. I had witnessed Antoine's last feverish night when he tried as desperately as anyone can try to write a poem for his mother. "It's crap," he said to me. "Everything that I write is crap. I'm a nobody." I assured him, even though I was nobody to assure him, that whatever he was writing was great. At one moment, I got carried away and stepped over certain boundaries I should never have crossed. "Take it from me, Antoine," I yelled. "I'm a worse nobody than you. You have a mother. I have nothing. Whatever you're writing is fine." Very politely, he asked me to leave his room. I had succeeded in making him feel stupid, having to listen to advice from a nobody kid. I bitterly regretted my outburst. I would have liked him to keep on being my friend. Antoine had his elegant overcoat neatly folded, draped over his right shoulder. He was wearing a most beautiful green suit, English cashmere. My grandmother spoke. "You have to hurry up, dear," she said. "Time is of the essence. You have to leave. If you don't, these people will kill you for the money." She was referring to her daughters and their husbands, who were beyond fury when they found out that their mother had quietly disinherited them and that the hideous Antoine their archenemy was going to get away with everything that was rightfully theirs. "I'm sorry I have to put you through all this," my grandmother apologized. "But as you know, time is independent of our wishes." Antoine spoke with his grave, beautifully modulated voice. He sounded more than ever like a stage actor. "It'll take but a minute, Mother," he said. "I'd like to read something that I have written for you." It was a poem of thanks. When he'd finished reading, he paused. There was such a wealth of feeling in the air, such a tremor. "It was sheer beauty, Antoine," my grandmother said, sighing. "It expressed everything that you wanted to say, everything that I wanted to hear." She paused for an instant. Then her lips broke into an exquisite smile. "Plagiarized, Antoine?" she asked. Antoine's smile in response to his mother was equally beaming. "Of course, Mother," he said. "Of course." They embraced, weeping. The horn of the taxi sounded more impatient yet. Antoine looked at me where I was hiding under the stairway. He nodded his head slightly as if to say, "Goodbye, take care." Then he turned around, and without looking at his mother again, he ran toward the door. He was 37 years old, but he looked like he was 60. He seemed to carry such a gigantic weight on his shoulders. He stopped before he reached the door when he heard his mother's voice admonishing him for the last time. "Don't turn around to look, Antoine," she said. "Don't turn around to look, ever. Be happy and do. There is the trick. Do." The scene filled me with a strange sadness that lasts to this day. A most inexplicable melancholy that Don Juan explained as my first-time knowledge that we do run out of time. The next day, my grandmother left with her counselor/manservant/valet on a journey to a mythical place called Rondonia, where her sorcerer helper was going to elicit her cure. My grandmother was terminally ill, although I didn't know it. She never returned, and Don Juan explained the selling of her holdings and giving them to Antoine as a supreme sorcerer's maneuver executed by her counselor to detach her from the care of her family. They were so angry with Mother for her deed that they didn't care whether or not she returned. I had the feeling that they didn't even realize that she'd left. On the top of that flat mountain, I recollected those three events as if they had happened only an instant before. When I expressed my thanks to those three persons, I succeeded in bringing them back to that mountaintop. At the end of my shouting, my loneliness was something inexpressible. I was weeping uncontrollably. Don Juan very patiently explained to me that loneliness is inadmissible in a warrior. He said that warrior travelers can count on one being on which they can focus all their love, all their care. The marvelous earth, the mother, the matrix, the epicenter of everything we are and everything we do, the very being to which all of us return, the very being that allows warrior travelers to leave on their definitive journey. Don Genaro proceeded to perform then an act of magical intent for my benefit. Lying on his stomach, he executed a series of dazzling movements. He became a blob of luminosity that seemed to be swimming as if the ground were a pool. Don Juan said that it was Genaro's way of hugging the immense earth, and that in spite of the difference in size, the earth acknowledged Genaro's gesture. The sight of Genaro's movements and the explanation of them replaced my loneliness with sublime joy. "I can't stand the idea that you're leaving, Don Juan," I heard myself saying. The sound of my voice and what I had said made me feel embarrassed. When I began to sob involuntarily, driven by self-pity, I felt even more chagrin. "What's the matter with me, Don Juan?" I muttered. I'm not ordinarily like this.
What's happening to you is that your awareness is on your toes again,
he replied, laughing. Then I lost any vestige of control and gave myself fully to my feelings of dejection and despair. I'm going to be left alone, I said in a shrieking voice. What's going to happen to me? What's going to become of me?
Let's put it this way,
Don Juan said calmly.
In order for me to leave this world and face the unknown, I need all my strength, all my forbearance, all my luck, but above all, I need every bit of a warrior traveler's guts of steel. To remain behind and fare like a warrior traveler, you need everything of what I myself need. To venture out there the way we're going to is no joking matter, but neither is it to stay behind.
I had an emotional outburst and kissed his hand.
Whoa, 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 he said. Next thing, you're going to make a shrine for my huaraches.
The anguish that gripped me turned from self-pity to a feeling of unequaled loss. You're leaving, I muttered. My God. Leaving forever. At that moment, Don Juan did something to me that he had done repeatedly since the first day I'd met him. His face puffed up as if the deep breath he was taking inflated him. He tapped my back forcefully with the palm of his left hand and said, "Get up from your toes. Lift yourself up." In the next instant, I was once again coherent, complete, in control. I knew what was expected of me. There was no longer any hesitation on my part or any concern about myself. I didn't care what was going to happen to me when Don Juan left. I knew that his departure was imminent. He looked at me, and in that look, his eyes said it all. "We will never be together again," he said softly. "You don't need my help anymore. And I don't want to offer it to you, because if you are worth your salt as a warrior traveler, you'll spit in my eye for offering it to you. Beyond a certain point, the only joy of a warrior traveler is his aloneness. I wouldn't like you to try to help me either. Once I leave, I am gone. Don't think about me, for I won't think about you. If you are a worthy warrior traveler, be impeccable. Take care of your world. Honor it. Guard it with your life." He moved away from me. The moment was beyond self-pity or tears or happiness. He shook his head as if to say goodbye, or as if he were acknowledging what I felt. "Forget the self, and you will fear nothing in whatever level of awareness you find yourself to be," he said. He had an outburst of levity. He teased me for the last time on this earth. "I hope you find love," he said. He raised his palm toward me and stretched his fingers like a child, then contracted them again against the palm. "Ciao," he said. I knew that it was futile to feel sorry or to regret anything, and that it was as difficult for me to stay behind as it was for Don Juan to leave. Both of us were caught in an irreversible energetic maneuver that neither of us could stop. Nevertheless, I wanted to join Don Juan, follow him wherever I went. The thought crossed my mind that perhaps, if I died, he would take me with him. I saw then how Don Juan Matus, the Nagual, led the 15 other seers who were his companions, his wards, his delight, one by one to disappear in the haze of that mesa toward the north. I saw how every one of them turned into a blob of luminosity, and together they ascended and floated above the mountaintop like phantom lights in the sky. They circled above the mountain once, as Don Juan had said they would do, their last survey, the one for their eyes only.
their last look at this marvelous earth, and then they vanished. I knew what I had to do. I had run out of time. I took off at my top speed toward the precipice and leaped into the abyss. I felt the wind on my face for a moment, and then the most merciful blackness swallowed me like a peaceful subterranean river. The return trip. I was vaguely aware of the loud noise of a motor that seemed to be racing in a stationary position. I thought that the attendants were fixing a car in the parking lot at the back of the building where I had my office apartment. The noise became so intense that it finally caused me to wake up. I silently cursed the boys who ran the parking lot for fixing their car right under my bedroom window. I was hot, sweaty, and tired. I sat up on the edge of my bed, then had the most painful cramps in my calves. I rubbed them for a moment. They seemed to have contracted so tightly that I was afraid I would have horrendous bruises. I automatically headed for the bathroom to look for some liniment. I couldn't walk. I was dizzy. I fell down, something that had never happened to me before. When I'd regained a minimum of control, I noticed that I wasn't worried at all about the cramps in my calves. I'd always been a near hypochondriac. An unusual pain in my calves, such as the one I was having now, would ordinarily have thrown me into a chaotic state of anxiety. I went then to the window to close it, although I couldn't hear the noise anymore. I realized that the window was locked and that it was dark outside. It was night. The room was stuffy. I opened the windows. I couldn't understand why I'd closed them. The night air was cool, fresh. The parking lot was empty. It occurred to me that the noise must have been made by a car accelerating in the alley between the parking lot and my building. I thought nothing of it anymore and went to my bed to go back to sleep. I lay across it with my feet on the floor. I wanted to sleep in this fashion to help the circulation of my calves, which were very sore, but I wasn't sure whether it would have been better to keep them down or perhaps lift them up on a pillow. As I was beginning to rest comfortably and fall asleep again, a thought came to my mind with such ferocious force that it made me stand up in one single reflex. I had jumped into an abyss in Mexico. The next thought that I had was a quasi-logical deduction. Since I had jumped into the abyss deliberately in order to die, I must now be a ghost. How strange, I thought, that I should return in ghost-like form to my office apartment on the corner of Westwood and Wilshire in Los Angeles after I'd died. No wonder my feelings weren't the same. But if I were a ghost, I reasoned, why would I have felt the blast of fresh air on my face or the pain in my calves? I touched the sheets of my bed. They felt real to me. So did its metal frame. I went to the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. By the looks of me, I could easily have been a ghost. I looked like hell. My eyes were sunken with huge black circles under them. I was dehydrated or dead. In an automatic reaction, I drank water straight from the tap. I could actually swallow it. I drank gulp after gulp as if I hadn't drunk water for days. I felt my deep inhalation. I was alive. By God, I was alive. I knew it beyond the shadow of a doubt, but I wasn't elated as I should have been. A most unusual thought crossed my mind then. I had died and revived before. I was accustomed to it. It meant nothing to me. The vividness of the thought, however, made it into a quasi-memory. It was a quasi-memory that didn't stem from situations in which my life had been endangered. It was something quite different from that. It was rather a vague knowledge of something that had never happened and had no reason whatsoever to be in my thoughts. There was no doubt in my mind that I had jumped into an abyss in Mexico. I was now in my apartment in
Los Angeles, over 3,000 miles from where I'd jumped, with no recollection whatsoever of having made the return trip. In an automatic fashion, I ran the water in the tub and sat in it. I didn't feel the warmth of the water. I was chilled to the bone. Don Juan had taught me that at moments of crisis, such as this one must use running water as a cleansing factor. I remembered this and got under the shower and let the warm water run over my body for perhaps over an hour. I wanted to think calmly and rationally about what was happening to me, but I couldn't. Thoughts seemed to have been erased from my mind. I was thoughtless, yet I was filled to capacity with sensations that came to my whole body in barrages that I was incapable of examining. All I was able to do was to feel their onslaughts and let them go through me. The only conscious choice I made was to get dressed and leave. I went to eat breakfast, something I always did at any time of the day or night, at Ship's Restaurant on Wilshire, a block away from my office apartment. I had walked from my office to Ship's so many times that I knew every step of the way. The same walk this time was a novelty for me. I didn't feel my steps. It was as if I had a cushion under my feet, or as if the sidewalk were carpeted. I practically glided. I was suddenly at the door of the restaurant after what I thought might have been only 2 or 3 steps. I knew that I could swallow food because I had drunk water in my apartment. I also knew that I could talk because I'd cleared my throat and cursed while the water ran on me. I walked into the restaurant as I had always done. I sat at the counter, and a waitress who knew me came to me. "You don't look too good today, dear," she said. "Do you have the flu?" "No," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "I've been working too hard. I've been up for 24 hours straight writing a paper for a class. By the way, what day is today?" She looked at her watch and gave me the date, explaining that she had a special watch that was a calendar too, a gift from her daughter. She also gave me the time, 3:15 a.m. I ordered steak and eggs, hash-browned potatoes, and buttered white toast. When she went away to fill my order, another wave of horror flooded my mind. Had it been only an illusion that I had jumped into that abyss in Mexico at twilight the previous day? But even if the jump had been only an illusion, how could I have returned to LA from such a remote place only 10 hours later? Had I slept for 10 hours? Or was it that it had taken 10 hours for me to fly, slide, float, or whatever to Los Angeles? To have traveled by conventional means to Los Angeles from the place where I had jumped into the abyss was out of the question, since it would have taken 2 days just to travel to Mexico City from the place where I had jumped. Another strange thought emerged in my mind. It had the same clarity of my quasi-memory of having died and revived before, and the same quality of being totally foreign to me. My continuity was now broken beyond repair. I had really died, one way or another, at the bottom of that gully. It was impossible to comprehend my being alive, having breakfast at Ship's. It was impossible for me to look back into my past and see the uninterrupted line of continuous events that all of us see when we look into the past. The only explanation available to me was that I had followed Don Juan's directives. I had moved my assemblage point to a position that prevented my death, and from my inner silence, I had made the return journey to LA. There was no other rationale for me to hold on to. For the first time ever, this line of thought was thoroughly acceptable to me, and thoroughly satisfactory. It didn't really explain anything, but it certainly pointed out a pragmatic procedure that I had tested before in a mild form when I met Don Juan in that town of our choice. And this thought
seemed to put all my being at ease. Vivid thoughts began to emerge in my mind. They had the unique quality of clarifying issues. The first one that erupted had to do with something that had plagued me all along. Don Juan had described it as a common occurrence among male sorcerers. My incapacity to remember events that had transpired while I was in states of heightened awareness. Don Juan had explained heightened awareness as a minute displacement of my assemblage point, which he achieved every time I saw him by actually pushing forcefully on my back. He helped me with such displacements to engage energy fields that were ordinarily peripheral to my awareness. In other words, the energy fields that were usually on the edge of my assemblage point became central to it during that displacement. A displacement of this nature had two consequences for me: an extraordinary keenness of thought and perception, and the incapacity to remember, once I was back in my normal state of awareness, what had transpired while I'd been in that other state. My relationship with my cohorts had been an example of both of these consequences. I had cohorts, Don Juan's other apprentices, companions for my definitive journey. I interacted with them only in heightened awareness. The clarity and scope of our interaction was supreme. The drawback for me was that in my daily life, they were only poignant quasi-memories that drove me to desperation with anxiety and expectations. I could say that I lived my normal life on the perennial lookout for somebody who was going to appear all of a sudden in front of me, perhaps emerging from an office building, perhaps turning a corner and bumping into me. Wherever I went, my eyes darted everywhere, ceaselessly and involuntarily, looking for people who didn't exist, and yet existed like no one else. While I sat at Ships that morning, everything that had happened to me in heightened awareness, to the most minute detail, in all the years with Don Juan, became again a continuous memory without interruption. Don Juan had lamented that a male sorcerer who is the Nagual perforce had to be fragmented because of the bulk of his energetic mass. He said that each fragment lived a specific range of a total scope of activity, and the events that he experienced in each fragment had to be joined someday to give a complete conscious picture of everything that had taken place in his total life. Looking into my eyes, he had told me that that unification takes years to accomplish, and that he had been told of cases of Naguals who never reached the total scope of their activities in a conscious manner and lived fragmented. What I experienced that morning at Ships was beyond anything I could have imagined in my wildest fantasies. Don Juan had said to me time after time that the world of sorcerers was not an immutable world, where the world is final, unchanging, but that it's a world of eternal fluctuation, where nothing should be taken for granted. The jump into the abyss had modified my cognition so drastically that it allowed now the entrance of possibilities both portentous and indescribable. But anything that I could have said about the unification of my cognitive fragments would have paled in comparison to the reality of it. That fateful morning at Ships, I experienced something infinitely more potent than I did the day that I saw energy as it flows in the universe for the first time, the day that I ended up in the bed of my office apartment after having been on the campus of UCLA without actually going home in the fashion my cognitive system demanded in order for the whole event to be real. In Ships, I integrated all the fragments of my being. I had acted in each one of them with perfect certainty and consistency, and yet I had no idea that I had done that. I was, in essence, a gigantic puzzle, and to fit each piece of that puzzle into place produced an effect that had no name. I sat at the counter at Ships, perspiring profusely,
pondering uselessly and obsessively asking questions that couldn't be answered. How could all this be possible? How could I have been fragmented in such a fashion? Who are we really? Certainly not the people all of us have been led to believe we are. I had memories of events that had never happened as far as some core of myself was concerned. I couldn't even weep.
A sorcerer weeps when he is fragmented,
Don Juan had said to me once.
When he's complete, he's taken by a shiver that has the potential, because it is so intense, of ending his life.
I was experiencing such a shiver. I doubted that I would ever meet my cohorts again. It appeared to me that all of them had left with Don Juan. I was alone. I wanted to think about it, to mourn my loss, to plunge into a satisfying sadness the way I had always done. I couldn't. There was nothing to mourn, nothing to feel sad about. Nothing mattered. All of us were warrior travelers, and all of us had been swallowed by infinity. All along, I had listened to Don Juan talk about the warrior trap. I had liked the description immensely, and I had identified with it on a purely emotional basis. Yet I'd never felt what he really meant by that, regardless of how many times he'd explained his meaning to me. That night, at the counter of ships, I knew what Don Juan had been talking about. I was a warrior traveler. Only energetic facts were meaningful for me. All the rest were trimmings that had no importance at all. That night, while I sat waiting for my food, another vivid thought erupted in my mind. I felt a wave of empathy, a wave of identification with Don Juan's premises. I had finally reached the goal of his teaching. I was one with him as I had never been before. It had never been the case that I was just fighting Don Juan or his concepts, which were revolutionary for me because they didn't fulfill the linearity of my thoughts as a Western man. Rather, it was that Don Juan's precision in presenting his concepts had always scared me half to death. His efficiency had appeared to be dogmatism. It was that appearance that had forced me to seek elucidations and had made me act all along as if I had been a reluctant believer. Yes, I had jumped into an abyss, I said to myself. And I didn't die because before I reached the bottom of that gully, I let the dark sea of awareness swallow me. I surrendered to it without fears or regrets. And that dark sea had supplied me with whatever was necessary for me not to die, but to end up in my bed in L.A. This explanation would have explained nothing to me 2 days before. At 3 a.m, in ships, it meant everything to me. I banged my head on the table as if I were alone in the room. People looked at me and smiled knowingly. I didn't care. My mind was focused on an insoluble dilemma. I was alive despite the fact that I'd jumped into an abyss in order to die 10 hours before. I knew that such a dilemma could never be resolved. My normal cognition required a linear explanation in order to be satisfied, and linear explanations were not possible. That was the crux of the interruption of continuity. Don Juan had said that that interruption was sorcery. I knew this now as clearly as I was capable of. How right Don Juan had been when he'd said that in order for me to stay behind, I needed all my strength, all my forbearance, and above all, a warrior traveler's guts of steel. I wanted to think about Don Juan, but I couldn't. Besides, I didn't care about Don Juan. There seemed to be a giant barrier between us. I truly believed at that moment that the foreign thought that had been insinuating itself to me since I had woken up was true. I was someone else. An exchange had taken place at the moment of my jump. Otherwise, I would have relished the thought of Don Juan. I would have longed for him. I would have even felt a twinge of resentment because he hadn't taken me with him. That would have been my normal self. I, truthfully, wasn't the same. This thought gained momentum until it invaded all my being. Any residue of my old self that I may have retained vanished then. A new mood took over. I was alone. Don Juan had left me inside a dream as his agent provocateur. I felt my body begin to lose its rigidity. It became flexible by degrees until I could breathe deeply and freely. I laughed out loud. I didn't care that people were staring at me and weren't smiling this time. I was alone, and there was nothing I could have done about it. I had the physical sensation of actually entering into a passageway that had a force of its own. It pulled me in. It was a silent passageway. Don Juan was that passageway, quiet and immense. This was the first time ever that I felt that Don Juan was void of physicality. There was no room for sentimentality or longing. I couldn't possibly have missed him because he was there as a depersonalized emotion that lured me in. The passageway challenged me. I had a sensation of ebullience, ease. Yes, I could travel that passageway, alone or in company, perhaps forever. And to do this wasn't an imposition for me, nor was it a pleasure. And it was more than the beginning of the definitive journey, the unavoidable fate of a warrior traveler. It was the beginning of a new era. I should have been weeping with the realization that I had found that passageway, but I wasn't. I was facing infinity at ships. How extraordinary. I felt a chill on my back. I heard Don Juan's voice saying that the universe was indeed unfathomable. At that moment, the back door of the restaurant, the one that led to the parking lot, opened, and a strange character entered. A man, perhaps in his early 40s, disheveled and emaciated, but with rather handsome features. I'd seen him for years roaming around UCLA, mingling with the students. Someone had told me that he was an outpatient of the nearby Veterans Hospital. He seemed to be mentally unbalanced. I'd seen him time after time at ships, huddled over a cup of coffee, always at the same end of the counter. I'd also seen how he waited outside, looking through the window, watching for his favorite stool to become vacant if someone was sitting there. When he entered the restaurant, he sat at his usual place, and then he looked at me. Our eyes met. The next thing I knew, he had let out a formidable scream that chilled me and everyone present to the bone. Everyone looked at me, wide-eyed, some of them with unchewed food in their mouths. Obviously, they thought I had screamed. I'd set up the precedence by banging the counter and then laughing out loud. The man jumped off his stool and ran out of the restaurant, turning back to stare at me while with his hands he made agitated gestures over his head. I succumbed to an impulsive urge and ran after the man. I wanted him to tell me what he'd seen in me that had made him scream. I overtook him in the parking lot and asked him to tell me why he screamed. He covered his eyes and screamed again, even louder. He was like a child, frightened by a nightmare, screaming at the top of his lungs. I left him and went back to the restaurant. "What happened to you, dear?" the waitress asked with a concerned look. "I thought you ran out on me." "I just went to see a friend," I said. The waitress looked at me and made a gesture of mock annoyance and surprise. "Is that guy your friend?" she asked. "The only friend I have in the world," I said.
that was the truth. If I could define friend as someone who sees through the veneer that covers you and knows where you really come from. The end. This is Luis Moreno. We hope you have enjoyed this production of The Active Side of Infinity by Carlos Castaneda. Recorded books are available wherever audiobooks are sold, including audible.com, audiobooks.com, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and in public libraries through RB Digital. Thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.